Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, text 40, chapter 3, and third canto, part 1, chapter 1, text 40. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. 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 Please repeat. Aho. Aho. Ritapi. Ritapi. Driyate. Driyate. Arbakarte. Arbakarte. Aho. Ritapi. Driyate. Arbakarte. Aho. Ritapi. Driyate. Arbakarte. Aho. Pritapi. Driyate. Arbakarte. Aho. Rajarshi Varyena Vinapi Tena Rajarshi Varyena Vinapi Tena Rajarshi Varyena Vinapi Tena Yas Tav Eka Viro Adirato Vigye Yas Svayeka Viro Adirato Vigye Yasva eka viro adirato vijige Danur Divitiyaha Kakubash Shetashraha Danur Divitiyaha Kakubash Chatashraha Danur Divitiyaha Kakubash Chatashraha Tapi riyate ar bakarte Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Yaspeka Viro Adirato Dijige Divitiyaha Kakubash Chatashra Aho Pitapi Priyate Advakate Aho Pitapi Priyate Advakate Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Yasva eka viro dirato vigaye Yasva viro dirato vigaye Danur vitiya kakubashtatashraha Danur vitiya kakubashtatashraha Aho pitapi triyater pakarte Aho pitapi triyater pakarte Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Yasveta Viro Dirato Vidige Yasveta Viro Dirato Vidige Hanud Vitaya Kakopashtatashra Hanud Vitaya Kakopashtatashra Aho Pitapi Kakarte Aho Pitapi Kakarte Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Rajarshi Varyena Vinapitena Sevira Dirato Vidige Sevira Dirato Vidige Hanud Vitaya Kakopashtatashra Hanud Vitaya Kakopashtatashra
Kunti. Api, also. Diriyate, bears her life. Arbaka arte, for the sake of the fatherless children. Vajarshi, King Pandu. Varyena, the best. Vina api, without him. Tena, him. Yaha, one who. Two, but. Eka, alone. Viraha, the warrior. Adirata, commander. Vijaya, could conquer. Danu, the bow. Divitayaha, the second. Kakubaha, directions. Chatashraha, 4. Translation. Please repeat. Oh my Lord, is Prita still living? She lived only for the sake of her fatherless children. Otherwise, it was impossible for her to live without King Pandu, who was the greatest commander, and who alone conquered the 4 directions, simply with the help of a second bow. I'll read that again. Oh my Lord, is Prita still living? She lived only for the sake of her fatherless children. Otherwise, it was impossible for her to live without King Pandu, who was the greatest commander, and who alone conquered the 4 directions, simply with the help of a second bow. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. A faithful wife cannot live without her Lord, the husband, and therefore all widows used to voluntarily embrace the burning fire which consumed the dead husband. This system was very common in India because all the wives were chaste and faithful to their husbands. Later on, with the advent of the age of Kali, the wives gradually began to be less adherent to their husbands, and the voluntary embrace of the fire by the widows became a thing of the past. Very recently, this system was abolished, since the voluntary system had become a forcible social custom. When Maharaj Pandu died, both of his wives, namely Kunti and Madri, were prepared to embrace the fire, but Madri requested Kunti to live for the sake of the younger children, the 5 Pandavas. This was agreed upon by Kunti at the added request of Vyasadeva. In spite of her great bereavement, Kunti decided to live, not to enjoy life in the absence of her husband, but only to give protection to the children. This incident is referred to here by Vidura because he knew all the facts about his sister-in-law Kunti Devi. It is understood that Maharaj Pandu was a great warrior and that he alone, with the help of bow and arrow, could conquer the world's 4 directions. In the absence of such a husband, it was almost impossible for Kunti to live on even as a widow, but she had to do it for the sake of the 5 children. Translation. O my Lord, is Pita still living? She lived only for the sake of her fatherless children. Otherwise, it was impossible for her to live without King Pandu, who was the greatest commander and who alone conquered the 4 directions simply with the help of a second bow. I guess everybody's familiar with that term, pyre. You know, I looked it up in that old dictionary I have, and it says that a pyre is a pile of combustible material piled up. That's a pyre. And that, have you ever heard that term, suttee? S-U-T-T-E-E? That's another from Funk and Wagnall Dictionary, that 1946 that I have. I looked that up. Suttee, S-U-T-T-E-E. Definition, formerly the sacrifice of a Hindu widow on the funeral pyre of her husband, now forbidden. So I guess I'm saying it right.
Sati.
Okay, that's right. That's what I used to know. Sati?
Yes, sati.
Yeah, because when I looked it up, I mean, it was a little confusing how to look it up. Because Sati. Yeah. So when you say Sati, is that Vedic? Is that Indian or?
Yeah.
It is. Okay.
Not Sati, Sati.
Sati.
S-A-T-I.
Sati. Am I saying it right? Sati? Not Sati.
Yes,
Sati.
Sati.
Okay, thank you. Okay, reading from the Mahabharata. Give me a little background. One day Pandu went out hunting. He saw a couple of large deer mating. They bolted when they saw the king, but he quickly fired 5 swift arrows after them. As the golden feathered shafts pierced the male deer, it fell down crying. To the king's surprise, the dying deer began to speak in a pained voice. Oh, how shameful! Even degraded men who are slaves to their senses never act so cruelly. No man's judgment can ever prevail against scriptural ordinance. How then have you, the king and a descendant of the noble Bharata race, acted in this way, so in conflict with Vedic direction? Pandu stood before the deer, which was weeping bitterly, and replied, As a king, it is my duty to hunt. I must control the forest, making it safe for the rishis. At the same time, I am able to practice the kingly art of weaponry. Why, even great sages in the past have killed deer in the forest by offering them in sacrifice. Oh dear, why then do you reprove me? The deer replied that it did not condemn Pandu for injuring it, but for not taking into consideration that it was mating. The animal then told Pandu that it was a rishi named Kendama. He had assumed the form of a deer to mate with his wife in the woods. The rishi had no dwelling and could not unite publicly with his wife in a human form. He had therefore transformed himself and his wife into deer. The king had killed him just as he was about to beget a child in his wife's womb. Kendama continued, No creature should be attacked at the moment. Your act was cruel and sinful and is liable to lead you to hell. It is especially reproachful as you are a king and are meant to chastise the wicked and protect the tenets of religion. Pandu gazed at Kendama in shocked silence. The sage had spoken correctly. It had certainly been sinful to shoot at the deer as it was mating, but how had he allowed himself to be so overcome with passion? And what would come from killing a rishi? This was a calamity. The king gazed downward, sunk in shame and regret. Seeing Pandu's crestfallen condition, Kendama said, You need not fear the sin of killing a Brahmin, as you did not know my true identity. But as you killed me when I was indulging in pleasure, so too shall you meet your death at such a time. The rishi wanted to free Pandu from his sin. By cursing the king, Kendama knew that Pandu would immediately receive the reaction for his misdeed and thus not have to suffer after death. Struggling to speak as his lifeblood ebbed away, Kendama uttered his fearful imprecation. Quote, When next you approach your wife out of desire, you will immediately fall dead, O king. As I was plunged into grief when I was happy, you shall also meet with grief at such a time. The deer then gave up his life. Pandu stood for some moments unable to move. As he gazed at the deer's dead body, hot tears ran down his cheeks. Gathering his wits, he returned to his hut. He immediately told his wives what had happened. Afflicted by sorrow, the king cried aloud with his two queens. He condemned himself again and again, holding his head and lamenting. Pandu spoke in an anguished voice. I have heard that my father, although born of a virtuous man, was himself a slave of lust and died as a result. Having been begotten in the wife of a lustful king, I too have become afflicted with lust. I have become devoted to sin. My life is simply spent in killing innocent creatures. The gods have forsaken me. I stand cursed. Pandu resolved to live a life of austerity. He decided that from that moment he would accept the vow of celibacy, as Bhishma had done. He would seek salvation by renouncing all sexual pleasure, the great impediment to spiritual understanding. Pandu spoke to his horrified wives, I shall shave my head and cover my body with dust. Sorrow and joy will be equal to me. I will entirely renounce anger and devote myself to the good of all creatures. I will accept no gifts and obtain my food by begging. In this way I shall transcend the dualities of this world and rise to the highest regions, where the Lord himself resides. The king asked his wives to return to the capital and inform his elders of the turn of events. They should gratify the Brahmins on his behalf, giving them much wealth. For his part, he would immediately retire into the wilderness and leave society forever. Kunti and Madri were torn by grief. They could not face the prospect of separation from their husband. In piteous voices, they begged that he allow them to follow his path. Both queens were prepared to accept whatever austerities he accepted. On behalf of them both, Kunti said, quote, let us together accept the order of Vanaprastha, retirement in the forest. We shall be happy practicing asceticism with you. If you leave us today, we shall not bear our lives any longer. Seeing their distressed condition, Pandu relented, but he made it clear that he intended to perform the strictest austerities. His wives were not deterred. They wished only to be with him wherever he went. Pandu resolved to embark on his ascetic life immediately. He would not return to the city. He removed all his royal ornaments and gave them, along with his riches, to the forest Brahmins. Then he said to his attendants, go back to Iskanapur and inform Bhishma of everything that has occurred. The royal attendants, accompanied by the Brahmins, left sorrowfully for Hastinapur. The citizens lamented loudly when they learned of Pandu's plight. Dhritarashtra was especially afflicted. Thinking of Pandu living so austerely in the forest, he could no longer derive pleasure from the comforts of his bed, servants, and royal opulence. He continually wept and brooded over Pandu. Okay, moving forward. On Saptashrota mountain, spring had arrived. Surrounded by his 5 youthful sons, Pandu felt young again. He sported with the boys in the hills, scaling rock faces and challenging lions in their caves. They dived and played in the mountain pools and climbed up tall trees. Wrestling and laughing together, they rolled about the soft grassy slopes. One evening, Pandu went into the woods of Madri to fetch roots and fruits for their evening meal. As they strode, they saw countless varieties of blossoming trees and bushes. The air was heavy with scent, and the sounds of cuckoos and other birds filled the air. Black bees swarmed about the many-colored flowers that surrounded lakes overgrown with lotuses. The celestial atmosphere awoke romance in Pandu's heart. He gazed at the beautiful Madri, his mind influenced by Cupid. Pandu could not suppress his desire. He had kept himself in check for 12 years and had not dared to contemplate embracing his wives. Kendama's curse was always uppermost in his mind, and he had resigned himself to practicing celibacy with the determination of a rishi. It seemed ages ago when he had been able to enjoy embracing his wives. Now Pandu again felt those springs moving his heart. His mind was confounded, and he moved closer to Madhuri, gently placing his hand on her arm. Madhuri at once understood what was Pandu's heart. Out of fear of the curse, he had carefully avoided any physical contact with her or Kunti for a long time. Although she herself had longed for his embrace, she had scrupulously avoided any situation that might entice her husband so. She did not even apply cosmetics or perfumes. But as the powerful Pandu embraced her, she felt her resolve weaken. Madhuri tried to push her husband away. Pandu smiled. Overpowered by desire, he could not even hear her, as she reminded him of the curse. As if impelled by the Lord of Death himself, the monarch entirely abandoned reason under the influence of lust. No thought of Kandama's curse entered his mind as he lost himself in enjoyment with his fair-skinned wife. Even as he tried, Pandu's chest was seized with terrible pain, and a shocked look crossed his face. His body stiffened and went slack. As Pandu's lifeless body fell from hers, Madhuri let out a wail of sorrow. Her worst fears had been realized. Despite all her protests, she had not been able to prevent her husband's death. The distraught queen repeatedly embraced her dead husband and lamented loudly. Kunti heard Madhuri's cries and ran to where she lay. As Kunti approached, the tearful Madhuri told her to come alone without the children. Kunti quickly sent the boys back to the ashram, then rushed to Pandu's side. She dropped to the ground, realizing at once what had happened. Kunti cried out piteously, "My lord!" Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to Madhuri. "Noble lady, how have you allowed this to happen? I was always so careful to protect our lord from this very danger. How did he embrace you, knowing of the Rishi's curse? Why did you tempt him when you were alone together? He was always grave in our company as he thought of Kandama's words. How did he become so careless?" Madhuri wept, unable to reply. Kunti tossed about on the ground next to her. The two beautiful ladies embraced their husband's dead body and shed profuse tears. Kunti again addressed Madhuri, "O Princess of Madhura, you are surely more fortunate than I, for you saw our Lord's face light up with joy as he approached you in this lonely place." Gathering her senses, Madhuri replied, "Sister, with tears in my eyes, I tried to resist him, yet he could not control himself. He seemed bent on fulfilling the Rishi's curse." Kunti prayed for strength. Somehow this was God's arrangement. The ways of providence were always mysterious. But what should be done now? What was her duty? She gently stroked the head of her younger co-wife and said, "There is only one recourse for me. Please allow me to ascend to heaven with our Lord. Rise up and raise our children. Give me the body, and tightly embracing it, I shall enter fire." So Kunti was the one who, she's the first one to say that I'll please allow me to go. Madhuri shook her head. She pleaded with Kunti. "The monarch died as he approached me. His desire was not satiated. And she's begging Queen Kunti to let her go. Madhuri felt incapable of bringing up the children by herself. Kunti would be a far better mother. Madhuri had seen her gentle dealings with the boys. She would surely treat them all equally. Madhuri begged Kunti's permission to enter the fire with Pandu. "The king sought me with desire. Grant me leave to fulfill that desire. You would be doing me the greatest good. Although heartbroken at the thought of leaving them, I shall leave my sons in your care without any fear." Kunti looked compassionately upon Madhuri as she lay with her arms around Pandu, bathing him with her tears. The noble Kunti's heart was torn. Although as the elder wife, it was her privilege to choose to follow the king to the next world, how could she deny Madri? It was to her that Pandu had been attracted. If Madri were to live, she would live with the memory of that brief and terrible moment all her life. Guilt would consume her, along with the anguish of being unable to fulfill her Lord's last desire. Although she longed to follow her husband, Kunti could not be so cruel to her co-wife. She touched Madri gently, saying, "So be it." Kunti then went with a heavy heart toward the ashram. When the boys heard of their father's death, they were struck with grief. They ran crying to where he lay and fell to the ground like powerful lions rolling on the earth. Madri blessed them tearfully and told them that she would be ascending the pyre with her husband. She asked her 2 sons to remain with Kunti and to serve her steadfastly. The boys were too shocked to reply. They watched as the rishis built a pyre next to the king's body, then reciting mantras, placed his body upon it. They asked Yudhisthira to step forward. The prince, blinded by tears, set fire to the pyre and stood back. As the flames rose, Madri folded her palms and then threw herself onto the Lord's body, holding tight as the fire consumed them both. Within minutes, both she and Pandu were gone. For some time, Kunti could say or do nothing. She stood staring at the dying embers of the pyre, surrounded by the 5 boys. Finally, she drew a deep breath and went slowly over to the rishis. In a broken voice, she asked, "What is my duty now?" The rishis advised Kunti to return to Iskanapur with her boys as soon as possible. They also told her they would accompany her, carrying the remains of Pandu and Madri with them. The large number of rishis, siddhas, and charnas formed a procession walking ahead of Kunti and her sons. By their mystical powers, they all arrived at Iskanapur within a short time. Kunti then presented herself at the northern gate, and messengers ran swiftly to inform the king. Upon hearing of her arrival, Dhritarashtra, Bhishma, Satyavati, and all the other Kuru elders hurried to the gate, followed by a large number of citizens who had heard that an assembly of celestials had arrived. Everyone was struck with wonder to see the brilliant rishis surrounded by siddhas and charnas. People came out in the thousands to see those divine beings. Dhritarashtra, along with his 100 sons, bowed before the rishis. Bhishma and the others also offered their respects to the sages, and after offering them seats, sat before them on silk mats spread out on the ground. When the crowd was finally settled, Bhishma went forward and worshipped the rishis by bathing their feet and offering them the sacred arghya. He answered their inquiries about the kingdom's welfare, saying that everything was well. Then one of the leading rishis stood up and addressed the Kuru elders. The virtuous monarch went to the Saptashrota mountain to observe the vow of celibacy. Somehow, by the Lord's inscrutable plan and the arrangement of the gods, his 5 sons were born. The rishi introduced each of Pandu's sons and revealed the identities of their divine fathers. He told them how the boys had been trained in Vedic knowledge and had grown to youthhood in the company of rishis and siddhas. Glancing about the large concourse of men who had assembled outside of the city, the rishi said, quote, "Steadily adhering to virtue and leaving behind him these children, Pandu has ascended to the higher worlds. The chaste Madri had gone with him. Now his sons should be accepted as the kingdom's rightful heirs." The rishi pointed to a bier lying nearby, covered with a white cloth. "Here are the remains of Pandu and his wife. Perform the funeral rites and accept his sons as if they were your own. We shall now depart." When the rishi stopped speaking, he, along with all the other rishis and celestial beings, vanished. In astonishment, the citizens returned to their homes. Bhishma then led Kunti and the boys into the city and arranged for their accommodation in a royal palace. Dhritarashtra ordered the funeral rites to be performed and declared a state of mourning in the city for 12 full days. The Kurus were distracted with grief over the loss of Pandu. All the citizens had dearly loved Pandu, and they loudly lamented. Pandu's 5 sons, known as the Pandavas, lay on the bare ground for 12 days, giving full vent to their grief. They did not accept royal comforts or beds, and they wept along with the Kuru elders. At the end of the mourning period, the Kurus performed Pandu's Shraddha ceremony. They distributed vast amounts of food and wealth to the Brahmins on behalf of the departed souls. Then life returned to normal in Istanbul, and Pandu's sons took their place in the royal family. It was at that time that Vyas chose to again appear in the city. He spoke privately to the bereaved and sorrowful Satyavati, "Dear mother, fearful and terrible times lie ahead. The dark age of Kali now approaches. Sin increases day by day. Soon by the evil acts of the Kurus, your race will be destroyed and a great havoc will be wrought in the world." Vyasa advised his mother to immediately retire to the forest rather than staying to witness the pain and horror that would soon follow. She should devote herself to yoga practice and meditation. After Vyasa left, Satyavati reflected on his words. She decided to follow his advice. She told her two daughters-in-law of her intentions and asked Pandu's heartbroken mother, Ambalika, to accompany her. The two royal ladies soon left for the forest to dedicate themselves to asceticism. In time, they gave up their bodies and went joyfully to the higher regions. Ambika remained at Istanbul with her son Dhritarashtra. Any comments, questions about the subject?
So Pandu's mother left also? Is that what you read just now? Pandu's,
Yeah, Satyavati.
so the grandmother left, huh?
Not at that point, she left later.
Well, actually, it's, I guess, the grandmother and the mother. I mean, after Vyasa left, Satyavati reflected on his words. She decided to follow his advice. She told her two daughters-in-law of her intentions and asked Pandu's heartbroken mother, Ambalika, to accompany her. Yeah, it's hard to imagine, but that's a different time, a different age, and you know, in each age that we pass, we become more bodily conscious. Until we get to the Kali Yuga, we're totally bodily conscious. But anyway, they say mind over matter. Well, we also say, mind over matter. We also say spirit over mind over matter. People say think outside the box. We say think outside the body. Transcendental means transcending this material world. There's a process for that, Bhakti Yoga. Anybody else have a comment or question?
No movie question, no movie stuff today, huh?
I know. You don't like it when I do that, so I refrain.
That's a regular thing.
I refrain from it.
Refrain from it?
Well, one thing funny is that they just come out with a movie called Tenet.